Good morning. Well, it's morning here. And where I'm standing today is the Perryville Battlefield. It's a battlefield from the Civil War. Let's take a look first behind me here. You can see a monument with a Confederate soldier. That's a Confederate monument. And we'll go in and take a little closer look and get some pictures of it, maybe some video of it here in just a few minutes. Where I'm at now is the plaque that describes the events I was talking about a few moments ago. This will give you a little better details. It says the Battle of Perryville ended with hundreds of soldiers dead. On the Confederates who attacked the Union battle lines, they lost 532 killed, 2,652 wounded, and 236 missing. The Union suffered 899 killed, 2,966 wounded, and 433 missing. And when they added up the numbers, the Union, of course, lost more killed, wounded, and missing than the Confederates. However, even though the Confederates attacking the battle lines of the Union had won a victory in sheer numbers and could have probably taken it away, there was apparently, it says, although Confederate Army won a tactical victory, they were outnumbered and left Perryville that night. It says in their haste, they left their dead and wounded on the battlefield. You know, there's always that mantra that you hear where it says no man left behind, but that's not always true. Sometimes it does happen that to get the main force out, they have to leave wounded behind, which is really a horrible thing to have to do. It said while the Union buried their own dead in regimental plots, they left the Confederate dead laying on the battlefield. Not only did they leave them laying there, within days, hogs were rooting at the bodies, buzzards and crows were picking and scouring the battlefield. And that's when a gentleman named Henry P. Bottom, a farmer who owned much of the land where Perryville's battle occurred, he gathered together citizens, and even he apparently had slaves at the time, and he gathered them with the citizens around the area, and they came together to form a burial party themselves and bury the Confederate dead. And it says Bottom recorded as many names as he could, but most of the soldiers buried here remain unknown to this day. It is likely that around 200 soldiers are buried in this mass grave. Union dead were later moved to Camp Nelson National Cemetery in Jessamine County, Kentucky. Despite the soldiers and citizens' effort to mark the burial site, scores of unmarked graves still exist on the battlefield. In 1902, the Commonwealth of Kentucky erected this monument to the Confederate cemetery, began efforts to preserve a historical location. So let's go look at the monument and see it a little up close. Sadly, they've apparently had problems with vandalism, and they've put like a gate area around it, but we'll get as close as we can. Take a look. All right, here we can see the monument itself. This was erected, as the other sign said, in 1902. It says on the front, "Nor braver bled for brighter and nor brighter land had cause so grand." And it says Confederate Memorial. It has the Confederate style battle flag on it, and that shows the crossed or the X'd blue area. Of course, it's not blue, it's in stone, but with the 13 stars, and then of course, I'm assuming the bottom is either rendered as white or red if it were rendered completely. On the side it lists names, and it says here on the very side low, it says, "On Fame's eternal campground their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round a bivouac of the dead." That's on one side of it. On the other side it says, "Nor wreck nor change, or winter's blight, nor time's remorseless doom, shall dim one ray of holy light that gilds your glorious tomb." That's on the left side as you're facing it. On the back, hopefully you can still hear me, it says, "Nor shall your glory be forgot while fame her records keep, or honor points the hallowed spot where valors proudly sleep." Those are the things that were put on there. Now again, this monument was erected in 1902, so many years after the Battle of Perryville had occurred. And my assumption would be, Kentucky was not a state that left the Union. They talk about how Kentucky in many of the histories that brother fought brother, and some citizens went with the South, some with the North, and there was many battlegrounds that occurred in Kentucky as well as Virginia and other places. But in this case, it would seem that even in 1902, they still showed reverence to the Confederates who lost, even though they were on the losing side. All right, this monument behind me here, it just lists the Army units of the Union that were here and took part in Perryville's battle. And it lists the date as October 8th, 1862. There's a whole lot more writing, of course, on it, but I'm not going to sit here and read every bit of it. It does list more smaller units, like under the 33rd Brigade, but again, I don't see the point in reading it all. I'm sure that you could Google the history of Perryville Battlefield and find all that information there. Behind me is an obelisk, and it was put up, it says Authorized Act of Congress approved March 3rd, 1928. So 1928 at this battlefield, it appears the Congress itself, and it does not specify Congress of the United States or Congress of Kentucky. I'm going to make the assumption this is Congress of the United States. Approved setting this monument. The thing that's interesting to me about this monument is you have it, which was installed in 1928. Back over there behind that small tree is the Confederate monument. And remember, it was installed in 1902 by Kentucky itself. So maybe there was a loyalty to the Confederacy somewhat here in Kentucky still in the 1900s in some of the officials that were in office, because why else would in 1902 they erect a monument only to the Confederate dead but not to the Union dead. Alright, we're going to move on some now, and I'm going to take us around the battlefield a bit. You can see in the background here that a great deal of this is like cornfields and plowed ground. And if I'm not mistaken, remembering from when I was younger, that is actually the battlefield. And so apparently it's still used for agriculture today, just like it was with a gentleman named Bottoms back in the Civil War. You can hear a lot of katydids that are chirping away in the background. They're all in the trees around me. But let's take a look down here. Hopefully you can see right here in the background behind me. In fact, I'll stop so I quit shaking the camera around. You can see the fence, split rail fence. Of course, just literally that, a split rail. They would split sections of wood from a tree, and then they would stack them in such a way that they held up over time, alternating back and forth. They weren't nailed together or tied together that I know of. They were just held by their own weight. There's a little building down here, and that's where I'm headed to, is to see what might be in this building, or it looks like there's no roof on it. Still might be something interesting to look at. So we'll see what we can see. I'm trying to keep me only partially in frame so you can see the ground and area behind me and see what there is to look at there. It's beautiful out here today. It's nice and sunny. It's been raining recently, and it is really hot and muggy, and it's only like 9 o'clock in the morning. But looks like they've stacked up some wood here to make wood fires with. And in fact, there's a little area marked out here where somebody's been having a fire. I'm going to make the assumption that this area I'm walking now is used as a campground. Wow, apparently somebody was here recently, because there's unmelted ice there on the ground. Anyway, the assumption I'm making is this campground area is used quite frequently preparing for the battles and after the battles and during the reenactments, which that's a part of the reason I came here today. Later in the year, I think it's either September or maybe it's going to be in October, there's a reenactment. I'll look it up on the internet and see when it is so that I can add it into this video. Yeah, this building looks like it's seen better days. We'll take a look at it though. You're going to get a look at it. It's pretty much falling down. And of course, this is not something from way back during the battle. This is something they built, I'm going to guess, for maybe reenactments, or it might have even been like a little booth to sell things from at one time, judging by the little shelf-like area, which is right down here. It's pretty much rotted away, most of it. It looks like it was built out of a hardwood, so it's sticking around still pretty well, considering probably it's been here for years. So let's move on and see what else we can see. Looks like the people that take care of the battlefield are out and on the job, because I see a gentleman over there. He's on a zero-turn mower, heading along to mow some of the earth. So let's keep going. There's a little bridge down here, and it looks like it's tied together with rope. I'm going to assume it's probably not just rope, but I thought it would be interesting to see it. And then I see a plaque on the other side that will no doubt explain something about the battlefield or talk about it. So wouldn't want to miss out on that. But let's stop for a moment and look at the bridge. Just a simple little bridge with walkway, stones set on this side. Looks like they did use a little bit of concrete and tie it together with rope. And of course, not old rope, but I'm sure nylon rope, or the rope would have rotted away long ago. The interesting thing is the wood, as I'm crossing it, feels a little bit spongy under my feet. Almost to the new marker that I saw. So we'll see what it says on it. And looking over it, it says sanctuary. As a final rage, Union soldiers in the brigade, General William Terrell's brigade, were driven from the ridge and split rail fence in front of you. Most of those troops had never been in combat. This inexperience sometimes led men and officers to try to find sanctuary from battle in dangerous places. Union Captain Robert B. Taylor was one of these inexperienced officers. Born in Frankfort, Kentucky in 1831, Taylor raised his infantry company and was quickly thrust into the Battle of Perryville. Here Taylor and his company fought in Terrell's brigade, and they were also forced from the fields in front of you. As the troops fell back, Taylor encountered one of the officers, Second Lieutenant Thomas Hutchinson, whose face was all bloody. Taylor discovered that Hutchinson had been struck in the head with a fragment from a shell, and the blood flowed from his face in streams. Thinking they would be safe in the gully, Taylor brought the injured soldier to this area. Taylor wrote that Hutchinson moaned and groaned and made me very miserable indeed. We were laying close in under the bank to protect ourselves from a shower of iron and hail that was raining all over us. When a cannonball struck within a few feet, we were sitting in a raised and immersed cloud of dust around us. With this close call, the wounded officer rushed to the hospital, and Taylor rejoined his company. Taylor, however, would never find a safe haven in Perryville. He was later wounded in battle. So, you can see it's just a small little dip in the ground. I can see why he would think, as they're calling it sanctuary. The time I spent in the Army, they called it cover, finding cover. But you can imagine, let me pan down, you can see there's a little ditch here today, and that's going to the little bridge we went to. Now, of course, anytime you put hilly ground like we've got here, you end up with ditches like this, whether they're man-made or whether they're not man-made. So you can imagine the battle raging, going on in the battlefield out that you can see beyond the trees there, and those two men coming down here and finding some shelter inside this ditch area until a shell landed very close to them, and then at that point they decided it probably wasn't a good idea to be here, probably a good time to move on. So I'm not going to keep the camera on as I walk up this hill here, but it looks like the walking path continues. I'm thinking there might be something else interesting to see up there, or another plaque that gives a description of the battle and what went on. So I'll move on up that way with the camera off and see what I find. I'll talk to you again soon. I got a couple of pictures of this plaque here behind me, and I'll talk about those just a bit as I go through it. It says, Act of Mercy. The Perryville Battlefield was a fierce fight, with 420 members of the 79th Pennsylvania Infantry fighting in these fields. This unit suffered 40 killed, 146 wounded, and 30 missing. This represents a loss of more than 50% of that unit. One gentleman in that unit says his name was William Woodward of Company D. He was shot in the left side by a Confederate buck and ball. And one of the pictures that I took a picture of was this. They used small buckshot and an actual mini ball put on it, and the load that it shows in the picture is indicated as being a .69 caliber. Well, if you picture like a smoothbore musket or even a rifled one, if you want more killing power, you can add more shot. It's kind of like they did with the cannons years ago when they would use grape shot or something like that. In this case, you have 4 different opportunities because it describes it as saying, shot in the left side by Confederate buck and ball round containing a round bullet and 3 smaller pieces of buckshot. Woodward was shot through the chest and lost a finger and part of his ear. Woodward's canteen was empty and he lay here the entire day bleeding and wounded from his multiple wounds. And it says later he was saved by an unlikely savior. Late that night, a Confederate soldier from the 41st Georgia found Woodward and gave Woodward of Pennsylvania a drink of water. When the Confederate discovered that Woodward's canteen was empty, he gave him his own canteen and tucked Woodward's and then went on his way. So, of course, they're attributing Woodward's survival to that Confederate soldier, which you can kind of picture when you're dealing out in battle with a whole array of men facing you. You're facing them. It might be easy enough to hate a group, but when you're confronted with one injured person on the battlefield and he's not a threat to you anymore, you know, today the standards are if the Army finds somebody that's no longer able to fight, they render aid to them, try to protect them, try to give them first aid and life-saving measures, and then take them as a prisoner back. In this case, an act of kindness, just something as simple as water, may have saved Woodward's life. And in fact, he did survive because the pictures that I took of the images, which I'm not sure whether they'll come out, but it shows him sitting on a porch with a dog, and that was after the war. Well, let's move on. I'm not really sure how well it's showing up, but this map here, and it shows right here, it says Prescott's Battery. And right below it, it shows Maney's and Stewart's brigades. We're standing at this very point on the top of this hill at the moment, and it's right where I showed you the cannon just a few minutes ago. This area of the battle, as it lists here, describes what happened here. There was a brigade, it was the Union Colonel John Starkweather, stood on this hill watching Terrell's brigade retreat. He realized the importance of this position. With his 12 cannons, Starkweather's brigade stood as the only Federal defense between the attacking Confederates and the Union wagons and ammunition and medical supplies. Of course, their supply trains, in other words. Brigade 21st Wisconsin fled past their position. Starkweather's men held firm and awaited the Confederate attack. It says, although nearing exhaustion, Maney's brigade, and that's the Confederate brigade attacking, found the strength to attack up another steep slope. They killed and wounded most of the Federal artillerymen and captured their cannons. But in the confusion of battle, they mistakenly fell back in retreat. Regrouping just past the road, the Confederates charged 2 more times. Now the road that they're talking about, you can see down below us. You can see the split rail fences and you can see the road there, which was probably a dirt trail back during the time of the Battle of Perryville. And of course, them being artillerymen, that's why they've put an artillery piece up here. Now the interesting thing about this artillery piece that's up here is right here on the side of it, on the cannon itself, where it was molded or where it was cast, it has stamped in at 1862. So you can pretty much surmise by that date that was some of the latest and greatest technology they had back then. It was a muzzle-loading cannon. And I'll move you a little further forward so you can take a look. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen in different war movies that are set in the Civil War how they use these cannons. They would have down here, as we look to the back, there'd be a wooden spike or wooden thing stuck right in here. and they would use that to turn the cannon left and right. Then, to control the elevation of the cannon, up here right behind the breech, you've got this twistable thing that can be spun to either elevate or lower the cannon. You've got a touch hole up here. Now, the reason they would cast them with this on the back is, depending on where the cannon was used, they could wrap rope around it and use it to control the recoil of the cannon. In the case of cannons like this one, they would load it, aim it, fire it, and it would roll back some, and then they would roll it back in. Now, when they would roll it back in, there's modern cannons that just slide back and then they, quote, return to battery. Well, in this cannon's case, it would fire, roll backwards, and they'd have to roll it, grabbing the wheels, and roll it, quote, back into battery. Of course, sadly, there's not a sign showing the cannon's caliber, or whether it's so many pounder or so many inch, but you can get a look at the muzzle end of the cannon from here. And of course, they would shove the round, the charge, and everything else down this end. And it does have US stamped in the top of it. You can see the hooks and eyes on the front there. And that's where you could have a bucket of water hanging. You could have other implements and tools hanging, so that as you rolled it back and forth into battery and kept firing it, you would have what you needed there. Maybe sand, maybe water to dip your sponge in so you could sponge out the cannon, because of course you did not want to shove another powder charge down the muzzle of this if there were still burning embers inside it. Of course, that would take off the cannoneer's arm and send the ramming rod way out to the enemy, and of course destroy it if the cannon went off while it was having a charge rammed home. There's another cannon over to the right of here, and I'll walk over there and we'll take a look at that one very shortly, and then I'll continue the video there. Alright, here's another marker. Now this describes after the fall of Starkweather's Hill. Now, of course, the other cannon we saw earlier before we arrived where we are was their original position. Now, looking back, in this direction and seeing how far you can see, and your enemy coming down that other hill, they could move quickly down that hill, but at the same time, they're totally exposed to fire from this hill. So it makes really good sense why you would have posted cannons up on this hill. It is the highest ground around here in all directions. So no matter which way your enemy came from, you could fight. Well, when they broke and ran finally after the Confederates had beaten them back, the ridge line behind us is where they went. Now that ground there is nearly as high as the ground we're standing on. And on this marker it says Starkweather's Hill. They're facing the hands begrimed from the smoke of battle and their ears ringing with the constant ripping of musketry. Starkwell's shattered brigade retreated to the ridge in front of you. And of course that's the ridge that way. They had saved half of their cannons by dragging them back to the new position, although their commander, General Terrell, was fatally struck by a shell just in front of you. The Union infantry took cover behind the stone wall that ran across the distant hill. Perryville's rolling terrain allowed the Federals to establish a strong defensive position behind the stone wall. Maney's Confederates regrouped and rushed through the valley. They fought desperately at the stone wall, assaulting it again and again. Finally, the Union counterattack forced Maney's exhausted brigade, now low on ammunition, to retreat back behind this hill. Both sides refused to renew the struggle. Maney's brigade fell back to Parsons Ridge, and Starkweather's troops retreated to the west. While Maney's attack helped the Confederates secure tactical victory at Perryville, Starkweather's stand saved a third of the units lost, over half of their command. The Confederate army soon marched out of Kentucky, never to return in any strength. So, like it said, Starkweather's brigade went that way, or Starkweather's unit went that way. The Confederates, after getting a real bloodying here, backed down this way into basically where they kept this hill between them where they couldn't shoot at each other. Now the interesting thing about the cannon here, let me move the camera out the front of it. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by going over the same stuff we talked about earlier. But you can see, looking at the muzzle of this cannon, This is a whole lot larger barrel than the other cannon we looked at a few minutes ago. Now it looks gold in color, but judging by what I'm seeing, I believe that's just a paint job on it. Not really sure why they painted it gold, but they did. And so the reason I mention that is a cannon that would have been this type color if it weren't iron and just painted. In fact, this one's iron because I can see where the paint's chipped. It is definitely an iron cannon. But there were also brass or bronze cannons that were used in combat going back many years before. The interesting thing about using brass or bronze, of course, it wasn't as durable, but it wasn't as heavy as iron cannons. And there was always the danger of the cannon, after being worn and worn and worn from explosions happening inside this metal tube, which was just bored out or maybe cast that way, is them exploding. And of course, brass and bronze not being as strong as iron, they would explode more often than the iron cannons. This one doesn't have any markings that I can see on it telling when it was made or where it was made. But either way, large caliber cannon, and you can picture facing down this hill. If you were trying to attack up that hill and the cannon shooting ball, possibly grape shot or other type shot. Now the ball would have just been a spear or sphere. It would have been a round cannonball, and it would have hit the ground and bounced and rolled along, and you know, if it hit you, it would hurt you. Now grape, on the other hand, and if they're using a large, it would be still, again, large steel balls, maybe big enough to fill the palm of your hand. And a sack of those with 8 or 10 of them in it shot at a mass of troops coming as they marched toward the line of fighting. You can imagine as they spread out, it's like shooting 5 or 6 birds with a shotgun. You would end up killing way more people with that. Now the other one, they talk about shot and shell. Well, a shot could be a round shot or a ball, but a shell, on the other hand, was usually a cast, I believe it was made of cast metal, hollow on the inside, and then it had an opening in it. And what they would do is it would be filled with gunpowder. And so you can picture, looking at this hill out in front of us, if you're trying to come up that hill, this cannon with a muzzle about this big around shoots a round, hollow steel ball that's filled with powder and then has a fuse-like device stuck in it so that it, when it's fired and the shell lands, it may insert itself some in the dirt or bounce along, but when it burns down, that fuse reaches the black powder on the inside, it explodes, shatters, and throws shell fragments all over the place, just like the shells we use today. So of course, that's a devastating weapon. In fact, that was the weapon that they talked about one of the leaders of one of the brigades was killed by during this battle. All right, let's move on and we'll see what's on the way back. All right, now we're in a different place, and let me pan the camera up first so you can see. You can see the hill we were on just a few minutes ago off in the distance up there, and where the cannons are. And so you can see we're having to look up at that hill, or hopefully you can notice that it's higher up elevation wise than where we're at now. The area where we're at now has a marker here also, and it's called the cornfield. It says, during the Battle of Perryville, a field of high corn stalks, brown and dry from a severe drought, covered this valley. Obscuring among the corn 663 members of the 21st Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. New recruits in the Army for less than a month, many had never fired a rifle in a battle. It must have been a terrifying experience. For more than an hour they listened as Terrell's brigade battled Maney's soldiers for control of the hill above the field. Then as the roar of battle crested the ridge, Terrell's panicked retreating soldiers burst through the corn. While many found the courage to hold their ground, some of the Wisconsin soldiers blended with Terrell's brigade and fled. As the Confederates advanced, Union artillery positions on the hill in front of you fired into the advancing Confederates. The Union's wooden sabots fell in the corn, killing and wounding the unfortunate members of the 21st. Victimized by fire from both armies, the Wisconsinites fired only once before retreating. During the brief, chaotic struggle, all the officers from the 21st Wisconsin were killed or wounded. Interesting thing about that with all the officers being killed is, depending on the period and depending on the units, many units didn't fight well unless they had their officers. However, in this case, you can imagine with chaos going around you, the cannons from up on the hill in front of you, firing down, or behind you, I should say at this point, firing down on you, and then turning back this way, coming down this hill at you, was the Confederates screaming, howling like banshees, firing, bayoneting, shooting. This wouldn't have been a good place to be even if you were hidden in the corn. So it goes on to say, showing some pictures and all, goes on to say, with the Union soldiers driven from the cornfield, brigade continued their attack towards Starkweather's Hill. And of course that's the hill we were just on before this. I looked upon the front. All at once I saw a rebel flag above the corn stalks, and not far away neither. I sat down on my right knee, said aloud as I could, "Boys, be ready, they're coming." They got on their knees. Some looked forward, some back at me. Instinctively I yelled, "Why don't we fire?" Looked to the right. The colonel was not there. I looked to the left. The major was not there. I leveled my rifle at the same butternut colored jacket which I saw coming through the stalks. Instantly the company followed suit. The Rebs staggered a little and in their turn saluted. Of course, in their turn saluted, you can imagine what that meant. As these guys here, they noticed, or this one that's quoted here, it just says Union soldier John H. Otto, 21st Wisconsin Infantry. He looked to one side, his colonel's dead. Looked to the other side, his major's dead. So he lifts his rifle to take aim. Butternut was the color of the uniforms that the Confederates were wearing as they charged down the hill and through the cornfields. So he takes aim. The men around him do the same. They fire. When they fire, they see the rebel, it said the Rebs staggered a little, and then in their turn saluted. Of course, they fired back. Next, we're going to go up on the hill. There's another marker up toward the top of this hill that I'm assuming will talk about something to do with the Confederates as they charged over. Give me a moment. We'll move up there and we'll take a look and see what we find. All right, we've moved again. We're up on top of the hill I talked about a minute ago. Let me give you a better view. You can see down in front of me, hopefully the white of the marker that I was just at. And then up on the hill, you can see the glowing gold of the cannon, and then like a tan-colored barn back off in the distance behind it. Of course, that tan-colored barn is where the brigade of Union soldiers backed all the way back to that ridge as they were pushed back. You can see via the rolling hills that each time, and it describes it a little bit on this board, which I'll read to you in a minute, how the terrain here drops over into little valleys, then back up ridge lines, and back over into little valleys. Up and down it goes. Well, of course, the Union wisely chose to do a defense in depth. They had units up on the hill we're currently on, which got pushed back. Then they had units remaining on the hill in front of us, which then they got pushed back. But they held at that third ridge line. They took extraordinary losses, as we talked about when I first started at the monuments to the dead. However, they did manage to, because there were so numerous of Union troops, not frighten, but make it imperative that the Confederates departed the area. So this is called Defense of Parsons Ridge. As Maney's Confederates reached the top of this hill, they watched the fleeing Union soldiers retreat into the valley in front of you. The Southerners lost hundreds of men killed and wounded during the fight to take the ridge, and their hearts must have sunk when they saw more Federal troops arriving on the ridge to the west. Because of Perryville's rolling terrain, the Union Army established one defensive position after another, each on a hilltop or ridge. While the hill marked the northern end of the Union battle line, other Federal soldiers arrived on the battlefield and occupied the ridge in front of you. Regrouping, Marney's brigade charged down the slope toward the new Union lines. Little did they know that 3 hours of intense fighting remained in the battle that would decide the fate of Kentucky. A comment or quote from a Confederate staff officer named Thomas Malone. The butchery was something awful. I remember thinking at the time that I could walk upon the dead bodies from where the enemy's line was established until it reached the woods some 300 yards away. Of course, in making this charge, we lost a great number of men. So the Confederates didn't have apparently as many soldiers as the Union did here. They did manage to inflict more losses in the Union. As you can see with the cornfield in front of us, it kind of makes sense why this area is planted in corn today. I'm assuming they do that, and possibly the state park plant corn there, because during the war and during the battle on October 8th, there was corn standing here. The interesting thing to me was the land belonged to the farmer that we talked about that buried the Confederate dead, him, his slaves, and citizens from around this area. This would have been his cornfield, would be the assumption based upon the land that the battle was fought on being his. That being his cornfield, it was October 8th, and he had not harvested his corn yet. I don't remember exactly when they harvest corn in this time of year, but maybe he had a lot of corn planted and he was harvesting over time. It also did say that due to a drought, the corn was dried and withered. So now I do know that corn does dry up in the late fall, and then it's often harvested just to get the grains of corn in. Sometimes it's harvested earlier than that to make silage. It could have very easily been that they just hadn't harvested it yet because it was stunted from the drought, or it could have been it wasn't quite ready to be harvested and the battle decimated their cornfield. Either way, let's move on and look at the next monument. Or before I do that, I'll spin the camera around. There's another cannon up here on this hill. And it makes sense that the cannons would have been sitting on the hills. Years ago, when I visited this battlefield, they had the cannons displayed down near the visitor center and down near the museum there. But since then, it seems they've moved them all up and sank concrete into the ground up here and then put the cannons on it. There's 3 markers here where cannons could have been mounted, and I see only 1 cannon. So it may be that the 2 cannons we saw before, the 2 up on the hill over there, maybe they were at one point here too, and they decided to move some over there to represent the Union's artillery positions. So let's go over and see what this other plaque here says, and we'll see if it describes the cannon and whether it was a Confederate cannon or Union. Considering it's facing the direction it is, to the east, I'm going to assume it would have been a representation of a Union position. And this plaque that we've just come upon says, Defense of Parsons Ridge. Union Brigadier General William Terrell was nearly panic-stricken. To his surprise, thousands of Confederates swarmed over the fields in front of you, moving toward the Union line or Federal lines. The shouts of attacking Southern troops and the crescendo of gunfire echoed among these hills. Terrell's troops, mostly new recruits, were still maneuvering into position as they faced the terror of their first battle. Now, before I go on reading, you can imagine in the Civil War, they still did march troops into battle lines, lined up with 2 or 3 or 4 ranks, and the men would then divide up 2 ranks to the front. One would kneel, one would stand possibly, they would fire, or they would stand offset, shoot their rifles or muskets at the enemy, shift back and let the other ones up while they reloaded. You can picture if they're still trying to march onto this hill, still trying to get into position to fight, they're not set up in such a manner to shoot and engage the enemy who's already attacking and shooting at them. You can imagine for new troops that have only really had parade ground drill and marching, that would be terrifying. They're not even getting to shoot back yet. So let's read on and see what else it says. Terrell ordered the 8 cannons on the ridge to fire into the Confederate ranks. As the ground shook from the cannon blast, Confederate troops appeared suddenly at the split rail fence at the base of the hill. Fearful that his artillery would fall into enemy hands, Terrell ordered a bayonet charge by the 123rd Illinois Infantry. It was a poor decision. Outnumbered as they were, driven back with heavy casualties. Even with reinforcements, Terrell's inexperienced men could not withstand the persistent Confederate attacks, who had now leapt the fence. Seasoned by battle, the Confederates determinedly loaded and fired, forcing the Federals from the hill and delivering a brutal initiation to the horrors of warfare. The picture on this, let me move the camera forward a little bit. Picture it shows here is Union Brigadier General William R. Terrell would die in battle. He was from Virginia and remained loyal to the Union States. His brother James, a general in the Confederate Army, was killed in 1864. Where he was killed, it talked about on one of the other plaques, was basically he made it into the valley area going up on the hill where the other cannons are there, and that's where this man died. If you look, you can see the split rail fence that is discussed in the background there, and there's tree lines now, but I'm going to assume, of course, these trees are not real super tall. They could have been there, or not them, but other trees might have been there, or no trees back then. There's a quote that says, Union soldier Bliss Morris, 105th Ohio Infantry. The rebels had the start of us by 2 rounds while we were forming and loading our pieces. There was no cessation of fire. It was a perfect hailstorm of balls at the time. And you can imagine, just like I was saying earlier, these Union soldiers, green, never been in battle before, still marching up and trying to get into position so they can shoot back because of the doctrine and the way they fought at the time. The Confederates are there just a little over 100 yards away, shooting and charging over after they'd climbed that split rail fence, storming up this hill toward these green, untrained Union troops. Well, I'm not going to say untrained, they probably were trained, but green, unblooded Union troops to give them their first taste of battle and blood in battle, and you can imagine the terror of that. Here's a quote from Union Major James A. Conley, the 123rd Illinois Infantry. Most of the bullets went over our heads and sounded like a swarm of bees running away in the hot summer air overhead. I find it interesting that he said hot summer air considering the battle took place in October. Today, you can see blue skies, kind of grayish clear for the most part with very few clouds. It's probably around 85 degrees. The humidity is extremely high. But I would expect in October 8th it would have been a lot cooler than it is today. Potentially not, though. If they had a drought that year, then it's very possible it could have been really hot still in October. Let's take a quick look at the cannon. It looks to me very much like the other one they had painted gold on the other hill. But I want to move down and get a look at the muzzle. Yep, it appears to be pretty much the same as the other one, the same size bore, same type of cannon. And what I do see back here at the touch hole, and let me get the camera and bring it here. Maybe the camera will pick up the view too. This could have been an older cannon. Now what I'm trying to show you is if you look at the touch hole right here, but look around it right over here. There's like a circle there. Now, the reason I bring that up, and I'll see if I can find a picture of how they did that on the internet and put it up. But if I remember right, sometimes the touch holes, of course, they would get larger and larger as the venting of the gas when the powder charge was ignited inside the cannon. Well, of course, them getting larger and larger, at some point, the gas and the abrasiveness of the powder would keep expanding them. And at some point, they literally would blow out more explosive power from the touch hole, and it would reduce the effectiveness of the cannon. If I remember correctly, I think what they did then is they took, it was like a cone-shaped piece of metal that had a hole bored through the middle of it. And what they do is they take a file and they would file out the touch hole. They'd keep filing it out and filing it out and filing it out. And when they got it filed out to shape of a cone going in from an angle, they would then take a piece of string and pull that cone of metal down through the cannon and pull it into what used to be the touch hole. And that new piece of metal would fill in and reduce the size of the touch hole. And what I'm wondering is how well that would have replaced the metal. I mean, it's a piece of metal, but it's not welded in, it's not formed to the actual metal of the cannon itself. So maybe it would extend the life of the cannon, but it also seems fairly dangerous that that plug could then at some point be blown out. But I'm assuming the thickness of the metal of the cannon itself and the fact that it was tapered, maybe it did a really good job. I'll try to look it up on the internet and see what I can find out about it. Let's move on and see what else we find. Alright, here we are now. I've moved to the next position. The interesting thing, each of these have numbers. This is number 5. I didn't notice that till just now. So I'm assuming, had I been wise and stopped at the museum, provided it's open, I could have probably got a map that showed all the area and explained to me where each thing was and where I should go in order to look at each thing. And it may be that I'm doing it backwards. I chose the route I did though because I'm doing this in the morning, and of course I want the sun behind me most of the time while I'm filming or taking pictures. This is the assault on Parsons Ridge. This is from the Confederate perspective. So far all of the things we've seen have been from the Union perspective, and in fact if you look up on the hill there, you can still see the Union position just to the side of the tree there, or at least where it's marked with the cannon. And you can also see this is a fairly steep incline. It's not that far, a little over 100 yards, but still, that would be a horrible 100 yards to go when you're being shot at. This plaque here says, Maney's attacking Confederates immediately discovered the lethal danger of attacking the 8 Union cannons on top of the ridge in front of you. Some sought cover behind the split rail fences. And let me spin the camera around just a second. And you can get a look. A split rail fence is not really something you could use for serious cover. And that's a lesson, as I'm going to read to you in just a minute, that the Confederate soldiers soon discovered. Because it says, some sought cover behind the split rail fence, but the Union artillery shattered the rails, killing and wounding scores of soldiers. The Confederate attack slowed and then stopped. Now you can imagine, you could stop here, and as I turn the camera around once more, you can see that it is a little of an incline here, and then there is another valley on the other side. They could have fell back into that valley, but to move back from this fence would have exposed them to the fire, even moving back to that valley. So it says, with bullets smashing against the remaining wood rails, the Confederates traded gunfire with the Union infantry. As casualties mounted, the Southern officers knew their men had to take the hill. If they attempted to retreat, they would be cut apart by Union artillery that survived. Urging their men forward, the officers crossed the fence and led a renewed charge. The intensity of the Union defense atop the steep slope stopped the Confederates again, only halfway to their objective. So you can imagine, from where we're standing, we're just in front of the fence. They only made it maybe to a little beyond the tree that you see to the left, which I've now put in the center of the camera view. So they made it a little further than that, and then they were pinned down again. Lying down to escape the cannon fire, Maney's men desperately loaded and fired their single-shot muskets as best they could. Some of the quotes that it has here, one is from Confederate Lieutenant Colonel William Pearson, 27th Tennessee Infantry. As soon as the fence was reached, a full view of the battery, such a storm of shell, grape, canister, and minie ball was turned loose upon us as no troop scarcely ever before encountered. Large boughs were torn from trees, and the trees themselves shattered as if by lightning, and the ground plowed in deep furrows. That's one quote. Another quote from Confederate Colonel George C. Porter, the 6th Tennessee Infantry. We came to a high fence at the edge of the wood, at which time it seemed impossible for humanity to go further. Such was the havoc and destruction that had taken place in our ranks. So the Confederates had been taking really heavy casualties up until this point alone. And as we've seen with me crossing each of these ridge lines, they still fought their way to the top of the ridge in front of us, up to the top of this hill. The top of that hill, then they fought their way down through the cornfield and up the next ridge. There was cannons on top of this hill. There was cannons on top of the next hill. Everywhere they tried to take a hill, the Union, with their in-depth or defense in-depth, had created points where the Confederates had to fight up a hill into the teeth of cannon fire. And as it discusses here, I hadn't seen it before, but it discusses the type of cannon charges that were used against them. And it talks about them using grape shot. It talks about them using mini balls in the cannons. It talks about them using cannonballs, and the cannonballs blowing apart trees, knocking limbs off trees. And of course, as it hit wood, of course, the wood would shatter and then become projectiles itself. And so you can imagine, with muzzle-loading rifles and cannons you had to muzzle-load, the slow rate of fire compared to modern weapons, this would have been just a horrible killing field. The only thing you could count on is hopefully a little respite between each volley of musket fire. But as often happened with American forces, they would fire volleys, but they weren't as disciplined, I guess you could say, about it, or as fanatical about it as like the British during the Revolutionary War. So once they started firing, they might fire independently. I don't know this happened here at this battlefield, but if you can imagine that hill above us arrayed with men, either kneeling or standing, and as you're trying to move up that hill, if they're firing in volleys, well, when you know it's time for the volley, maybe you can dive to the ground and the volley hopefully pass over you and then rise back to your feet and keep moving. But if they're firing each man individually, and so it's a ragged, just sputtering fire from all over the place, there's no way to really avoid a volley of fire. There's an interesting story that reminds me of, and it's an interesting book to read. The author was a gentleman named Ambrose Bierce, and he was oftentimes called Bitter Bierce. He wrote books that were set in the Civil War time period. In fact, he lived through it. And some of his books are very macabre. They're very graphic in their depictions of war. Well, one of the depictions is a story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And the main character was a gentleman named Peyton Farquhar. And he was a southern plantation owner, or at least a southern planter. And he might not have owned a great deal of land, but he did own a house, and he lived in the South. And someone made the comment to him about that it would be really good if a certain bridge was destroyed. And he took it upon himself to think that the bridge might be destroyed by setting fire below it with all the driftwood it got against it. The reason I mention that is part of one of the story that they talk about is he was captured and they were about to hang him, and in the story he escapes because the rope breaks when they dropped him between the railroad trestle to hang him. He falls into the water and begins to swim away as fast as he can. So as he's swimming away, the first time they fire, he can hear the commands of the officer in charge of the Union troops on the bridge, or near the bridge. And he hears them giving the command to take aim and to fire. Well, when he hears the take aim portion, he dives deeper into the water to avoid the mini balls of the muskets. He dives into the water, but as he rises back up, in the thoughts of Peyton Farquhar in the story, he thinks they fired a volley the first time. They won't make that mistake again. They're going to fire individually next, and there's no way he can avoid all those shots. So he was swimming away as fast as he could with musket balls whizzing about him. I'm not going to tell you any more about the story because it's a really cool story to read. Again, the author is Ambrose Bierce, and he died, I think, in California many years after the Civil War. Really good reads. He also wrote, I think he was the one that wrote, I think it was the Battle of Chickamauga. And I think it was where he depicted the battle through the eyes of a deaf child, seeing the carnage after the battle. But either way, if you don't mind reading things that are a little macabre and a little graphic, his writings are some pretty good reads. Okay, let's move on. Alright, we've made it back beyond the .5 on the tour, and I was stopped at this cannon because I wanted to show you again the muzzle of the cannon. Taking a look at this one is kind of in between the black one we saw before and also the gold painted ones that we saw more recently. So the muzzle is a different size. which means the bore's a different size, which means it shoots a different size cannonball. So let's move up closer to it and let's see. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to move around the cannon looking for markings. The one thing I've noticed right off is this cannon is shorter than the other ones. It's not as long. It has a shorter end from here to the front. And it does have some markings on the back. Looks like an N and a 3 with like a degree sign between them up high, then a percent sign, then a 2 and a 2 stamped or engraved into the breech of it back here besides the very back. The touch hole has a little indentation in front of it, possibly where they'd pour powder in the touch hole or shove a quirt in the touch hole and then maybe put a little fine gunpowder there so it was easier to touch off the cannon and fire it. From where we're standing, you can see just in the distance on the hillside where we were earlier, between the trees there, you can see the cannon up on the other hill. And so you can see, provided those trees weren't here during the Civil War, but as we read in that last narrative from the Confederate perspective, they were coming out of a set of woods when they came upon that split rail fence and those fields that were apparently open for farming. So you can imagine at this point, maybe a cannon here would have been a workable solution if they were in the woods. Maybe the cannon was sitting in the edge of the woods and shooting up onto the hill. But let's go look at the notes they've got here. And I'm going to set the camera up so we can still see not only where this marker is, which is named Maney's Attack, but I want you to be able to see in the background up on the hill, because I'm assuming what I consider logically that this would have been the point where the attack was formed. Now this is marker number 4. So apparently I am doing this tour backwards, and that kind of makes sense. I'm approaching it from the Union side moving back toward the Confederate side, and so I'm assuming they made the perspective of the monuments here, or markers, from the Confederate attacking perspective. Okay, let's see what it says. Confederate Brigadier General George Maney was growing concerned on the hill to your front. 8 Union cannons blasted away, killing and wounding dozens of Southern soldiers. Maney knew that his brigade had to take the hill and silence those guns quickly. As he formed his 1,600 soldiers into 2 lines in the fields behind you, trees and rolling terrain hid his men from the Union's battery. 4 Confederate cannons rolled into position here and began answering fire from the Union battery. So there were cannons here, and at least if they were coming out of the woods, it must have been behind where we currently are, because it talks about they were able to put cannons up here and exchange fire with the Union cannons. So the cannon here that we just looked at represents Confederate cannon, the first we've seen of Confederate cannons on the battlefield so far. Amidst the thundering concussion and swirling smoke of the close-range artillery duel, Maney's men advanced to within striking distance and then charged into the deadly fire of the surprised Union cannon crews. It talks about them charging and it talks about surprised crews, but it appears they charged from here to the split rail fence, which you can see just a little of in the tree line there. And then they moved on up on that hill, and you can't see the cannon from here, but I'm assuming you can see the white square of the marker that's up on top of that hill. So they would have came into view as they crested this hill, into view of the cannoneers on the hill, charged forward, made it to the fence, and as it discussed there, they would have stopped at the fence, tried to take cover. Their officers got them moving again. They made it about another 60 yards up the hill, stopped again, and paused there. But they did eventually take that hill. Then they took the charge down that hill through the cornfield that we discussed, up the next hill. Here's some quotes, and again, these are from the Confederate perspective. The first quote is Confederate First Lieutenant William T. Turner of Turner's Mississippi Battery. we commenced replying to a battery of their enemy, which had annoyed us considerably, opening up on us with guns of heavier caliber than ours. As soon as we commenced our firing, I continued until I received orders from General Cheatham to cease fire, and our infantry advanced and took the battery opposing us. This cannoneer, and as you noticed I mentioned when I was looking at the muzzle of the cannons they've placed here represent what was discussed in this well, because this cannon is shorter and has a smaller bore than the cannon that's sitting on the hill in front of us. There's another quote from Confederate Brigadier General George E. Maney. Parsons' battery opened up a devastating fire at close range with double canister, breaking the 6th Tennessee as if it had been hit with a hammer. As the units withdrew in disarray, I rode down to rally. Just as I reached their position, I was struck heavily by a fragment from artillery round which killed my horse and also wounded my aide, Captain Griffith. Well, this is number 3. I talked to him. My battery on the camera went dead. And as it went dead, of course, I was at number 4. So I had to go back to the car because, being as bright as I am, I didn't think to bring my backpack or the camera bag or the spare battery. Now I'm here with the spare battery in the camera, and I wanted to take and finish out the last of the markers before you get back to the main area. I talked to him inside the museum area, and sadly the museum, they don't allow photography or filming, so I couldn't get you any views of the inside of the museum itself. But it's $4 for adults. It's not very expensive, and it looked like it's not huge, but it has videos and has explanations, and they have a gift shop with some really neat stuff in there, and of course didn't get any pictures of that, sadly. But let's look at this last monument, and then we'll talk about the park itself a little bit. This says Stuart's advance. The battle opened with great fury. On your left, Donelson's brigade hurled themselves against the Union lines, but their attack momentarily stalled. In the fields to your right, Maney's Confederate brigade also assaulted the Federal position. It's that Maney's Confederate attack that we've literally been looking at, and there's numerous other things here. I'm going to pause for just a second in this monument marker here, or battle marker, to describe what they told me. There's 47 of these markers. I'm on number 3 now. And I think we started at like number 10, working our way backwards. So we didn't see near all of this park. The park actually has 900 and some acres of land, and it has walking trails which are kept mowed. The grass is down nice and neat. I haven't seen any snakes or anything else that would be an impediment. Now, of course, it's very hot out today, so if there's a snake around, he's probably off in the shade somewhere. But anyway, let's continue on with the marker here. To support these troops, Brigadier General Alexander P. Stewart's brigade, the last available troops in the division, entered the battle. Placing his 5 regiments into one long line, Stewart's men advanced behind the other attacking Confederate troops. Stewart's regiment immediately came under heavy Federal fire. At one point in combat, his Confederates grew panicked when they reached the split rail fence 250 yards directly to your front. And that's not in view. I'll lift the camera up so you can kind of get a look at the terrain though. You can at least see the terrain even if you can't see, well actually you can see the split rail fence now that I look. You can see it under the trees over there. In fact, if I can get the camera to be cooperative and turn, there we go. It's right in behind and under those trees right there in the center view of the camera. So, back to what it says. Instead of climbing over the fence or taking down the rails, dozens of his men tried to squeeze through the small openings. Scores were shot down as the troops attempted to force their way through the gates. Man-made structures on the battlefield could be deadly obstacles. Despite the severity of the fire, Stewart's brigade continued to move forward. They assisted in taking the hill to your front and the hill beyond before the Confederate attack ground to a halt. Here's a quote from Confederate Brigadier General Alexander P. Stewart. They entered the fight in admirable order and pressed forward under a galling fire with a coolness and yet impetuosity that could not be surpassed. They drove the enemy before them a considerable distance until they reached the crest of the ridge. All right, from here we can see one of the many areas they've got where you can have picnics, and you can rent the area to use where it's got water outlets. I've noticed that on different telephone poles there's electric outlets. Judging by where they're located, I don't think they're really for like RVs and the like. I think they're set up more for like festivals and things of that nature. But I'm not sure, you might could rent one of them if you wanted to have like a party or something else out here. But let's take a look around. It's also picnic tables and playgrounds. And the picnic tables are not all just set in one place. They're scattered around all over the park in different places, so you can just bring the family out here and have a nice picnic. Enjoy the warm weather, enjoy the sunshine. Well, the playground's really neat too. I decided to stop here at the playground and talk about it just a little bit because I'm not sure you can see really behind me, but this area where the swings are is set up with a nice rubberized containment barrier around it, and then they used bark mulch, wood chips, to fill it in so there's no grass, there's no dirt, it's soft. This is kind of a neat place for the kids to sit and play, and then there's benches nearby where you could enjoy watching the children play. It's got old school style swings that I remember from when I was a little kid, which are really sturdy, with my 200-pound self on it, not really causing a problem. The area around here, there's more split rail fence, there's more picnic tables off to the side. I showed you the covered picnic area earlier. There's not just one, but there's multiple of those covered picnic areas. So if you want to bring a large group out here, that'd be easy to do too. It's a really, really neat place, and if you haven't visited it, I would highly encourage you to visit the Perryville Battlefield. Now, on the 8th and 9th of October of 2016 this year, they'll be doing a Perryville Battlefield reenactment. When they do their reenactment, they have reenactors come from all over the place. Some of them come out as cavalry riding horses, some of them dressed as officers, some of them dressed as enlisted men, artillerymen. I've even seen some bring cannons. They do their best, as far as I've seen, to dress in period correct costumes. And if you're kind of like me, a history buff, and find history of any shape, form, or fashion intriguing, usually a lot of the reenactors are very well versed in their part of history, in who they are, what the battles were their unit would have fought in, and they can describe to you somewhat what life might have been like during the Civil War and during the time that the men came and fought. The battlefield itself is neat to see on its own. It really is an awesome place. The walking trails are great. If you just want to get out and get some exercise, then this is a great place to come. Of course, it's not open during the dark. In fact, it's prohibited entry into the battlefield in the dark. They don't allow metal detectors because they, of course, don't want scavengers searching over and digging up the battlefield trying to look for possible relics. It's beautiful out here today, even though it is rather hot. I've had a great time walking around. I've only scratched the surface of what's actually here at Perryville Battlefield. So if you want to see it all, you might want to make a day trip down here yourself and take a look at the battlefield. This is James. I hope you've enjoyed what I have shown you at the battlefield, and what little areas that I've walked through and talked about, and I'll see you again somewhere else in Kentucky.